Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving deep into something that's super important if you're an Arab student, especially here in the Emirates. We're talking about the TOEFL ITP test. And I know tests can be a little bit confusing, so we're here to make it all really easy to understand. To help us break it all down, we've got an expert with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So can you explain what the TOEFL ITP is all about? Like in simple terms, for our listeners who might be hearing about it for the first time.
Sure. It's a test to see how good your English is. Basically, it helps figure out where you are in your English learning journey. And it's mostly used to place you in the right English courses, to make sure you're not in a class that's too easy or too hard.
So it's not like those big TOEFL tests for getting into universities in, say, America or Canada.
Exactly. It's different from the TOEFL IBT, which is used for university admissions. This one, the ITP, is mainly for helping you succeed here within your current English program.
Gotcha, that makes sense. And I've heard there are a couple of different ways to actually take the ITP.
Yeah, you can take it on paper, the old school way, or on a computer. It's up to you. And there are two levels, level 1 and level 2, depending on, how comfortable you feel with your English.
Okay, so that's good to know. There are options. But no matter which way you take it, is it always multiple choice?
Yes, always multiple choice. So you don't have to worry about writing long essays or anything like that.
That's relief for some people, I'm sure. But what about the questions themselves? What kind of stuff will you actually get asked about?
Well, the test has three main parts. The first part is listening. So you'll hear recordings of people talking, maybe in a classroom or just everyday conversations. And then you'll answer questions about what you heard.
Okay, so that checks your listening skills. Makes sense. What's the next part?
The next part is about grammar. It's called structure and written expression, but really it's testing your knowledge of English grammar rules.
Ah, the grammar part. I remember that from my school days.
It's important.
And what about the last part?
The last part is reading. You'll get passages to read about different topics, things like science, history, or even just everyday life on a campus. And you'll answer questions to show that you understand what you've read.
So it's like a little taste of everything. Listening, grammar, and reading. All important skills for any student, for sure.
Exactly. And the topics aren't super complicated. They're things you might encounter every day in school or just in life in general.
That's good to know. So we've got a good idea of what's on the TOEFL ITP. But why should students here in the Emirates, why should they bother taking it? What are the real benefits, especially for someone who's really serious about their education?
It's a great question. First of all, it really shows everyone how good your English is, which can be helpful for lots of things like applying for scholarships or even internships. It also helps you get placed in the right English class, like we talked about before, so you're not too bored and you're not totally lost.
Right, you're in the sweet spot where you can actually learn and improve.
And of course, improving your English is always a good thing in general.
Absolutely, it opens up so many doors. So it's not just about passing a test, it's about setting yourself up for success in your education and even in your future career. And speaking of preparing for the TOEFL ITP, I know a lot of Emirati students are always looking for the best resources, the best ways to get ready. What would you recommend, especially for our listeners here in the Emirates?
Well, I'd strongly recommend the course offered by Mr. توفيق فرجاني.
I've heard his name. What makes his course so special, especially for Emirati students?
Well, Mr. فرجاني has years and years of experience teaching English at universities here in Abu Dhabi, so he really understands what Emirati students need to know to do well on this test.
That local knowledge is so valuable, isn't it?
It is, and his courses are designed to be super clear and easy to follow, even if your English is still, a work in progress.
So he breaks it down step by step.
Exactly, and he gives you tons of practice so you feel really comfortable on test day.
And I understand he has a really impressive track record with his students.
Absolutely. His students consistently get fantastic results on the TOEFL ITP. His teaching methods really work. They're proven.
That's a powerful endorsement. Where can our listeners find out more about Mr. فرجاني and his course?
You can find everything you need on his website. It's www.englishindeed.com.
Perfect. We'll make sure to share that link again later on so you don't have to scramble to write it down. Okay, so we've covered what the TOEFL ITP is, why it's important for Emirati students, what to expect on the test itself, and we even got a top-notch recommendation for a prep course. Now, I want to dig a bit deeper into something you mentioned earlier, the fact that the TOEFL ITP is different from those other big TOEFL tests, the ones that universities abroad use for admissions. How different are they, really?
That's a good question. Well, both tests evaluate your English skills, the TOEFL IBT, the one used by overseas universities. It's a bit more challenging. It has an extra writing section, and the topics are a bit more complex, a bit more academic.
Okay, so it's like the next level up. But does that mean preparing for the ITP is like a waste of time if someone eventually wants to take that IBT?
Not at all. The ITP helps you build a really strong foundation and the core skills you need for any English test, even the IBT.
So even though they're not the exact same, there's a lot of overlap.
Exactly. It's like building a house. You need a strong foundation before you can start adding the walls and the roof.
So prepping for the ITP is almost like a warm-up for those bigger TOEFL tests.
You could say that. So if you're planning to take the IBT later on, getting ready for the ITP can actually give you a head start.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's all about building those skills step by step. Now, I want to shift gears for a bit and talk about something that I know is on a lot of our listeners' minds. Money. Test prep can be expensive, and for many students, finding affordable options is really important.
You're absolutely right, and that's one of the things that makes Mr. فرجاني's courses so valuable. He's really committed to making quality TOEFL ITP preparation accessible to everyone. His prices are very reasonable, especially when you consider how much expertise and support he provides.
That's excellent news for our listeners. So not only is his course super effective, it's also designed to be affordable. Sounds like he's truly invested in helping Emirati students succeed.
Without a doubt, he understands the challenges that students here face, and he's passionate about making sure everyone has access to quality English education.
I love that. It's inspiring to see someone who's not just an expert, but also really cares about their students. Okay, let's quickly recap what we've covered so far. We've learned what the TOEFL ITP is, why it matters, what to expect on the test, and we've even got a fantastic recommendation for a prep course that's both effective and affordable.
Exactly. We've covered a lot, and I hope our listeners are feeling a bit more confident about the TOEFL ITP already.
Me too. But before we move on, there's one more thing I want to touch on. We've talked about the TOEFL ITP being a multiple choice test, which I'm sure is a relief for some people. But let's be honest, multiple choice can also be tricky. Sometimes those answer choices are so close, it's hard to know which one is really correct. Any tips for our listeners on how to tackle those tricky multiple choice questions?
Definitely. One of the biggest mistakes people make is rushing. They see a familiar word and just jump to a conclusion without really thinking about all the options.
Oh yeah, I've been guilty of that myself.
My advice is to slow down and really read each choice carefully before you decide.
So don't rush and read carefully.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to find the right answer is to start by eliminating the wrong ones. If you can cross out a couple of options that you know are definitely not right, it makes your decision much easier.
It's like a process of elimination.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to trust your gut feeling. If you've prepared well and you have a feeling about an answer, go with it.
Sometimes your intuition is right.
Often it is.
Awesome. Those are some really great tips for dealing with those tricky multiple choice questions. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
You're welcome. Always happy to help.
We're so glad to have you here on the Deep Dive. Now, for our listeners, we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we'll be diving even deeper into the world of the TOEFL ITP. We'll talk about specific strategies for each section of the test, common mistakes to avoid, and more. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for some more TOEFL ITT tips?
You bet. Let's jump right into those section-specific strategies you mentioned. What about the listening section? Any advice for our listeners who might find that part a bit tough?
For sure. In the listening section, it's really important to pay attention to those little details. Don't just try to get the general idea. Listen for specific things like names, dates, key facts. That's often what those questions focus on.
Makes sense. It's easy to get overwhelmed when you're listening in another language. But zeroing in on those specifics, that could really make a difference.
Absolutely. And here's another tip. As you're listening, jot down a few keywords or phrases that jump out at you. It can help you remember the main points and refer back to them when you're answering the questions.
That's smart, like creating your own little cheat sheet as you go.
Exactly. Now let's move on to the grammar section. I know that can be a bit scary for some students.
Yeah, grammar can definitely be tricky. What are your top tips for tackling that structure and written expression section?
First of all, don't panic. The grammar on the TOEFL ITP, it's pretty straightforward. It's all about the basics, things like subject-verb agreement, using the right tenses, articles, you don't need to know any super complicated grammar rules.
That's reassuring. So it's more about mastering those fundamentals than memorizing a whole bunch of obscure rules.
Exactly. And here's a helpful tip. When you're looking at a grammar question, try to figure out what specific grammar concept it's testing. Like, is it about verb tenses? Is it about prepositions? Once you know what to look for, the answer usually becomes a lot clearer.
Oh, that's a good point. It's like being a grammar detective.
Yeah, I like that. And lastly, don't be afraid to trust your ear. Sometimes the best way to tell if a sentence is grammatically correct is to just say it out loud to yourself.
That's great advice. Sometimes our ears can catch things our eyes miss. Okay, let's move on to the final section. Reading comprehension. What are your top tips for doing well in this area?
One of the most important things in the reading section is to be an active reader. Don't just skim, highlight key points, circle words you don't know. Try to summarize each paragraph in your own head. The more engaged you are with what you're reading, the better you'll understand it.
It's all about making those connections in your mind as you read.
Exactly. And when you're answering the questions, always go back to the passage to find proof for your answer. Don't rely on your memory or what you think it said.
Yeah, it's easy to get tricked by answers that sound right but aren't actually supported by what you read.
Absolutely. And finally, here's a tip that can save you time. If you're really struggling with a particular question, don't get stuck on it. Move on to the next one and come back to it later. Sometimes a fresh perspective can help you see things more clearly.
That's a great time management strategy. It's so easy to get hung up on one question and load precious minutes. Now, before we move on to talking about common mistakes, I want to circle back to Mr. فرجاني's TOEFL ITP course. You mentioned his impressive success rate. Can you tell us a bit more about what makes his course so effective?
Sure. One thing that really sets Mr. فرجاني's course apart is his focus on personalized learning. He actually takes the time to get to know each student, their strengths and weaknesses, and then he tailors his approach to each individual student. So you're not just getting generic advice, you're getting guidance that's specifically designed to help you succeed.
That's fantastic. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And he doesn't just teach you the content, he teaches you how to think about the test. He helps you develop those critical thinking skills so you can tackle any question with confidence.
That's so valuable. It's one thing to memorize facts, but it's another thing entirely to know how to use that knowledge strategically.
I agree, and that's what makes his students stand out. They're not just prepared, they're empowered. They've got the tools and the mindset to really conquer the TOEFL ITP.
That's amazing. It's clear he's not just teaching a test, he's teaching a life skill, how to be a confident, strategic learner.
Precisely. And that's why I highly recommend his course to any Emirati student who's serious about getting their best score.
You've definitely made a compelling case. I bet our listeners are eager to learn more. And speaking of learning, let's move on to those common mistakes you mentioned. What are some of the pitfalls students should watch out for when they're prepping for the TOEFL ITP?
One of the biggest mistakes is not practicing enough. Some people think they can just cram the night before, but that almost never works. The TOEFL ITP tests so many different skills, and you need consistent practice to build them up.
It's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Exactly. Think of it like training for a marathon. You wouldn't expect to run 26 miles without putting in the training beforehand. Same with the TOEFL ITP.
Right. Consistent effort is key.
Absolutely. Another common mistake is relying too much on translated materials. While it's fine to have some translations as a reference, it's crucial to immerse yourself in real English materials as much as possible.
You need to get used to how English actually sounds and feels.
Exactly. And lastly, a lot of students underestimate how important time management is during the test itself. They spend way too much time on one section and then have to rush through the others.
So pacing yourself is really important.
Absolutely. Before the test, practice working under timed conditions so you get used to how much time you have for each section. And during the test, keep an eye on the clock and make sure you're not getting bogged down on any single question.
Great advice. Thanks for sharing those common mistakes and how to avoid them.
My pleasure. Hopefully it helps our listeners feel more prepared and confident.
I'm sure it will. Now, before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more important thing. Mindset. We've talked about strategies and tips, but what about the mental game? How can students approach the test feeling positive and confident?
That's such an important point. A positive mindset can really make a huge difference. First of all, remember that the TOEFL ITP is just one test. It doesn't define your worth or your intelligence.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the pressure, but it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And secondly, believe in yourself. You've put in the work, you've prepared, you can do this. Go in with confidence and don't let self-doubt hold you back.
It's all about harnessing that inner strength.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to reach out for support. Talk to friends, family, teachers, anyone who can encourage you and help you stay positive.
Sometimes just having someone to talk to can make a world of difference.
It really can. And remember, even if you don't get the score you were hoping for on the first try, it's not the end of the world. You can always retake the test and you'll learn from the experience.
It's all part of the learning journey. Okay, we've covered a ton of ground today. We've talked about strategies, common mistakes, mindset, and we even got that fantastic recommendation for Mr. فرجاني's TOEFL ITP prep course, designed specifically for Emirati students like you.
I think our listeners are well equipped to tackle the TOEFL ITP with confidence now.
I agree. But before we say goodbye, I want to make sure everyone remembers Mr. فرجاني's website. Can you remind our listeners of the address where they can find more info about his courses?
Of course. It's www.englishindeed.com. There you'll find all the details about his TOEFL ITT courses, his teaching philosophy, testimonials from students who've aced the test thanks to his guidance.
Perfect. We'll also include that link in our show notes. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked a lot of the TOEFL ITP, but remember, it's just one step on your path to mastering English. Don't let this one test define your whole language learning experience. Embrace the challenges, celebrate your progress, and most importantly, never stop learning.
Well said. Remember, the world opens up when you can communicate in English.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the TOEFL ITP. We hope you've learned a lot and are feeling empowered to reach your English language goals.
Until next time.
Stay curious and keep learning. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the TOEFL ITP. We've covered so much, from what the test is all about to tips for each section.
We even talked about some common mistakes to avoid and how important it is to have a positive mindset.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up, I want to make sure we've given our listeners all the essential information they need. You mentioned earlier that you can take the TOEFL ITP on paper or on a computer.
Right.
Are there any big differences between the two formats that our listeners should keep in mind?
That's a great question. The content of the test is the same no matter which format you choose, but there are a couple of practical differences.
Like what?
Well, with the computer-based test, you can see your score right away when you finish.
Oh, wow. So no waiting for weeks to find out how you did.
Exactly. And on the computer, you can also use tools like highlighting and note-taking. Some people find that really helpful.
That makes sense. So it really comes down to personal preference, whether you're more comfortable with paper or a computer.
Exactly. The important thing is to choose the format that you feel best with, so you can do your best on the test.
Great advice. Now, I want to touch on one last thing before we say goodbye. What happens after the TOEFL ITP? Let's say someone gets a great score. What can they actually do with it?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, a good TOEFL ITP score can be a big help when you're applying for scholarships or even internships.
It's proof that you've got the English skills.
Exactly. It shows potential employers, universities, even yourself that you've reached a certain level of English.
So it's not just about a number, it's about creating opportunities for yourself.
Absolutely. And even if you're not applying for anything right now, a good score can be a huge motivator to keep learning and improving your English.
That's a great point. It's a reminder that learning a language is an ongoing journey. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. I feel like our listeners are well equipped to tackle the TOEFL ITP.
Me too. I hope they're feeling more confident and ready to take on the challenge.
Before we wrap up, can you remind everyone where they can find more information about the TOEFL ITP and, of course, about Mr. فرجاني's prep course?
Of course. Everything you need is on his website, www.englishindeed.com. You'll find details about the courses, what his teaching is like, and what other students have to say about their experience.
Perfect. We'll be sure to include that link in our show notes as well. And to all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the TOEFL ITP. We hope you've gained some valuable insights, picked up some helpful tips, and are feeling more confident about your English language journey.
Best of luck to everyone.
And remember, stay curious and keep learning.